So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are currently located. My name is Dimitris Ziouvas. I am moderating today's event. Allow me to say a few introductory words. So, first of all, thanks to all who are attending. I see that we already have almost 60 participants. I will allow a few more minutes for people to join the event, but during this time, allow me to say a few introductory words. So my name is Dimitris Ziouvas. I'm a professor of law at Pandion University of Athens for Social and Political Sciences in Athens, Greece. I'm also a law practitioner, practicing attorney at law in Athens, Greece, and in Germany. And for some time, I was a member of the advisory board of the Greek Anti-Corruption Authority. I have been working with international organizations like UNODC or the Council of Europe in consulting roles. And I'm currently the director of the European Center of Criminal Justice of Pandion University. Today, I would like to thank the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the School of Advanced Studies of the University of London, of which I have the honor of being a research fellow, for hosting today's online seminar. The Institute of Advanced Legal Studies offers postgraduate studies, master's and PhD studies in law. The event today is co-organized by Pandion University of Athens and the Institute, the Center for Criminal Justice, as well as the International University of Europe for Applied Sciences. So a big thanks to our hosts. Our topic today is corruption and good governance in sports. Before giving the word to our experts and panelists and speakers, allow me to say that this event is being video recorded. So whoever attends is muted, but we have a Q&A box, a Q&A session, which will follow up after all speakers have concluded their presentations. So if you have any feedback, if you would like to share with us comments, remarks, or pose a question, please feel free to write and type your feedback in the Q&A box, which can be seen at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I would like also to say a few introductory words about our topic today. Let me start with good governance in sports. And let me briefly touch upon the notion of governance and the notion of good governance. Good governance, ladies and gentlemen, is about making decisions. So governance is about making decisions. It is the decision-making process, which is integral to every organization and to every person, actually. So we are discussing processes of governing, processes of making decisions. And we will be discussing processes which help make good decisions. And good governance means good decisions which take consideration of three aspects mainly: equality and equity, so treating people equally; efficiency, so making decisions in a speedy and effective way; and most importantly, ethically, so making ethical decisions. Ethics is at the cornerstone of good governance, and every good governance code has ethics deep in its wording. How can we make sports ethical, equitable, and efficient in terms of decision-making? This addresses the role of sport governance bodies and whichever organization is involved in sports. So sports, from a good governance point of view, have to be ethical, inclusive, and safe. As ethical, as inclusive, and as safe as possible. And since decision-making includes and requires having power to make decisions, every time we have power involved and a lot of money involved, because the sports industry is huge, marketing, advertisement, betting industry. We are discussing billions of dollars all around the world. It is a very transnational, it is an international business. It is important that these ethical decisions are free from corruption. How do we define corruption? Let me give you a very brief and quick definition. Corruption is abuse of power, public power, if we discuss public making decisions, or private power in the private sector for private gain. So what we will be discussing today is how can we govern sports making decisions of sport authorities, sport governance bodies, and any other stakeholder in sports. How can we make these decisions ethical and free of corruption? How can we protect sport from crime? And how can we stop organized crime infiltrate sport? Organized crime is something that has to do with organized groups, so criminal organized groups. These are groups of 3 or more persons which act jointly with 2 tasks. The first one being to commit serious crime, and the second one is to gain illicit profit, so to make money. So how can we stop crime from infiltrating sports, and how can we govern the sports industry in an ethical, inclusive way? It is important to be reminded that corruption touches upon sustainability. The United Nations have released the Sustainable Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goal number 16 speaks about peace and justice. And there is no peace and no justice if societies and institutions are corrupt. So it is important to think of sustainability, and it's also important to think of human rights. Sports touch upon human rights, and in that way, there is a very clear interlinkage, interplay between crime, sometimes, human rights, sustainability, and corruption. So having said this, I would now like to introduce to you our first speaker for today's event. I have the pleasure to welcome Professor Marko Begovic. Professor Begovic is a professor of sports management, policy, and leadership at Molde University in Norway. He's a sport management executive who has worked both in the public sector in Montenegro, working for the government and making senior decisions for the Ministry of Sports, and also a senior sport policy advisor. Marko Begovic is also the director of the European School of Sports Management, which is an important school within the International University of Europe for Applied Sciences. So Marko Begovic combines 3 qualities. He's an academic, he's a very seasoned and senior sports professional, and a public policy maker. So Marko, you have the word.
Professor Dimitris, what can I say after this kind of introduction? You left frame and limited space for me to intervene, but however, I will try to do my best. First, I'm going to try to share my screen, and then very, very briefly, I know that you have introduced me, and I will not misuse this opportunity, but very briefly, I want to share with all of you that I had an opportunity to see the sport from a different perspective. So I myself, I was an athlete, I was a tennis player, I was a coach, I work as a sport manager at a local sports organization or club, National Sport Federation, National Olympic Committee. And then I had an opportunity to work for the government of Montenegro in a number of occasions, including a senior position in international relations and high performance sport. That position bring me closer to the Council of Europe to enlarge and partial agreement of sport, where I serve in 2 mandates as a member of the governing board bureau. I was also gender equality rapporteur. and I work in a number of documents, both binding and non-binding documents, such as conventions, resolutions, and recommendations of the Council of Europe. Nevertheless, I try to utilize my expertise by working in a different sports ecosystems, from the national perspective to the more international, regional, international level. And of course, to round this up, I'm as Professor Dimitris says, associate professor at the Molde University College at this moment. So when we talk about corruption, I'm using this definition by Transparency International and World Bank, that corruption mean and the focus is on abuse of entrusted power. So this the main definition that took me to dig into deep in understanding different corruptive practices that are associated with the field of sport. But development of sport, as we know today, was quite conservative in a sense, focusing on as Chapelet indicated in his work on the classical Olympics system, where the focus is really was on the sport-specific nature and understanding and rounding the sport around the concept, a very conservative concept of amateurism. However, as the sport evolved within the drivers that led to the further development, like globalization, professionalization, commercialization, the sport, the global sports ecosystem has been changed. With the introduction of first court of arbitrage of sport as an attempt, at least in my view, to preserve a sport specificity that I'm going to reflect also on this term, and also with the scandals from 90s, beginning of 20s, introduction of the World Anti-Doping Agency as an international hybrid entity in charge of eliminating doping in professional sport. But as I said, it's a lot about sport specificity. Public officials, along with the sports representatives of the sport movement, want to say that sport is very specific. The nature of the sport is the specificity of sport is recognized by the Lisbon Treaty, and it's gonna send a very ambiguous status of the sport as activity. It's not only a health-related, social-related, education-related, but also has its economic dimension. Why is this important? Because with all of these drivers that I was referring earlier, commercialization, professionalization, and then again governmentalization inside the global sport, we have significantly expansion of the global sports ecosystem. As we know, today we have a great speaker from the UNODC, from the Council of Europe. They can reflect a lot on this, but this just show how the sport is kind of intervene network, international, intergovernmental, and hybrid institutions are really taking a pace, and a number of other initiatives in order to tackle the main topic of our discussion, to tackle the governance of sport. So I'm giving you a little bit of background because in the last part of in the second half of my presentation, I will be very practical with the different examples. So for many, when you have this network, a very complex structure, and at the national level you have very practical institutional relation between different stakeholders, public sector, ministries, governments on national, regional, or local level. You have a non-profit sector, mostly those are the national sport organization, and you have a commercial sector. So it's pretty well defined in that regard. And because of this complexity at the global level, many of these corruptive cases are under the radar, are out of reach of number of these intergovernmental and international institutions. So my job today is to go beyond my academic post, is really to share with you some of these pressing examples. Of course, before getting into that, just briefly, in order to explain you specific examples, I will share on the case of Montenegro. I will be using a tracker categorization, understanding how the sports ecosystem is set up. So we have the government as umbrella, Ministry of Sport and Youth, major body, governmental body in charge of sport. Until recently, we didn't have a national anti-doping organization. This was under the push of the World Anti-Doping Agency and also with support of the Council of Europe in that regard. And as a part of the sport movement, we have a Montenegro Olympic Committee as umbrella organization. How it look like? So the sport system in Montenegro is pretty interventionist. What does it mean? It means that, and centralized at the same time, it means that all major policy decisions are being adopted by the competent state institution, in this respect, Ministry of Sport and Youth, also in charge on preparing and drafting the final version of sports law that will be, and that is adopted before the parliament. As I indicated, National Olympic Committee is umbrella organization with the competencies to serve as association of all national sport federation, including non-Olympic and Olympic sport. Consolidated system because all the federations are part and bound to the National Olympic Committee of Montenegro. And what I was recently actually was focused on bureaucratic corruption, the corruption that happened within the administration, within primarily public sector. And then I was trying to understand the corruption facilitators, but also the sport-specific corruption cases that emerge from this bureaucratic corruption from the government on the governmental level. Very briefly about my theoretical framework that I use. So historical institutionalism as a part of contemporary institutionalism here is used just to understand how the institution has been established and how institution has been evolving throughout different periods. So I was trying to understand the root of potential or this problem that emerge, and then in order to really grasp these challenges, together with Professor Christos, we are just closely to publish one paper that's going to be around institutional theory, institutional entrepreneurship, and institutional work in particular. So I was using, together with Professor Christos, but also in some other works, just to understand the consequences of the root of the problem and how these problems can be tackled, disrupt, maintain, and develop more legally bind and institutions following the principles that you mentioned, Professor Dimitris, the principles of good governance. So very briefly on the work, so we use this three work within the development of the sport-specific legislation to tackle one of these corruptive problems in Montenegro. So when you look at the legal framework in Montenegro, when you look at the key legal instruments such as the law on public administration, law on public servant, or anti-corruption law, you see that all of these legal instruments have provision that actually enable and stimulating politically exposed person to be in charge of sports organization. However, this creates a kind of sui generis status of a number of sports organizations because of their legal nature, how they're established, but also how they perform, and most importantly, how they have been monitored their work. And then I was going to clientelistic structure, particularly Ministry of Sport and Youth, Ministry of Defense, corruption facilitators such as politically exposed persons and political actors, media outlets. Perhaps, Professor Dimitris, we should have a separate event just focusing on media and sport, how media can contribute, how enable corruptive practices, and sadly, some of the high performance athletes. And then I'm going to share with you a very specific corruption cases. So the first case, if you can see, is related to establishment of the World Anti-Doping National Anti-Doping Organization. Apologies. So in 2016, the National Olympic Committee of Montenegro actually established a National Anti-Doping Organization as any sort of the committee, such as an athletes committee or gender and sport committee, and etc. And this is, of course, in 2021 found by WADA as a breach of the World Anti-Doping Code, in particular Article 20.5.1, because this kind of setup really does not adhere to maintaining political, legal, organizational, and financial independence of the National Anti-Doping Organization. But why was this established like this? Because the members of this NADO was actually the public officials from the Ministry of Sport, because they wanted to be on the payroll of the National Olympic Committee in that regard. So this was in a sort of the patron-client relationship that was established, but not only in this regard, but these members of the Ministry of Sport and related institutions was also in charge on allocating public funds to the National Olympic Committee, often bypassing standards and procedures on allocating public funds to sport, using budgetary reserve and discretionary power. So this is one of these examples. The second example, and then how we tackle this challenge. So I was invited by the government of Montenegro at that time to take a role, the ministerial role in the Ministry of Sport. And what we mentioned earlier, there was three important works in that regard: political work, technical work, and cultural work. Political work was actually to get a relationship with World Anti-Doping Agency, with Council of Europe, with UNESCO, to gain the trust that we're gonna do everything in our power to adhere to internationally binding norms in this regard, to make necessary arrangements regarding the law, but also to establish a national anti-doping organization. But also I use this opportunity to include another provision in the law on sport that will forbid or limit politically exposed persons to serve in a sport, in a decision-making bodies of the sports organization. So this is the first example. And just to explain you how this work was complicated, I had less than 45 days, and you see the number of meetings to finish the job in order to Montenegro avoid potential suspension by the World Anti-Doping Agency and later before the CAS. So this was very, very an intense work. I'm trying, Professor Dimitris, to fly just to give you as much as possible information and maybe to give a motivation to our viewers and participants to ask some particular questions. So the meetings had primarily with the Council of Europe, WADA, and UNESCO, and then within the government to gain the trust and also to speak with each individual MPs in order to get their votes, because at that time political situation in Montenegro was quite polarized and no laws has been adopted. So this was actually only law in 4 months that was adopted by overwhelming majority. And the second example is also indicating and related to the National Olympic Committee. Here is the picture. It's not a perfect one, but I get the original picture from the submission for the Winter Olympic Game Beijing 2022. Here, if you see first two amount, 35,000, 38,000. Actually, the second amount, they asked for money that was already for the accommodation of athletes, for the delegation of NOC, that is already provided by the local organizing committee and by the International Olympic Committee. It's not the first time. If you see London 2012, you see the accommodation for athletes they ask, and they get 150,000 euros. We all know that accommodation is covered for all athletes competing at the Olympic Games. Tokyo 2020, transportation for NOC team, 300,000 euros, despite the fact that the IOC and local organizing committees covering more than 80% of these expenses. So this is the second case. And the third case is related with the organization of particular competitions. So European Chess Union in 2012 grant to the Chess Federation of Montenegro to organize the European Championship. It transferred the organizational rights to the National Federation. That federation later transferred the rights to the local NGO, not directly related to chess, that further transferred the rights to the company in Belgrade. All participation fee that was mandatory for all participants was not paid in the Montenegro. The special accounts has been opened in Delaware and Slovenia in that regard. And in that regard, in Montenegro got almost 400,000 Swiss francs missing of tax that needed to be paid for this competition. So this is the third case. And the fourth case is a staggering one. I would say it's a very recent case. I was engaged by the European Handball Federation in the arbitration proceeding regarding, if you see the female handball player, she was the captain and the best player of Montenegro handball team for many years, playing for the club Budućnost. This is one of the best clubs in Europe, winning 2 European championships. When she got pregnant, she was immediately suspended. So I was invited by the European Handball Federation to investigate this case, to provide a legal opinion. And actually what I found is the way how the legal relationship were operating. For example, with professional players, they had 2 contracts. One is the membership contract, like the recreation, like you going to the gym and signing the membership contract. And another one was actually the agreement, special agreement on mutual rights and responsibility that included provision on the non-disclosure agreement. And this was actually in contrary to the law on sport, which obliged that professional athletes should be conclude a contract with the sports organization in respect to the labor law and related legislation. So in that regard, just in this case, it was found that more than 600,000 euros was unpaid mandatory contribution. And this is one hand, and you have only one player. So we are talking about a roster of 12 players. We are talking about at least 10 players with a similar amount of contracts. But what is very frightening is that this is not the only club that operated in such a way. I later dig even deeper and find out that most of the clubs operated that in that manner. And now we are talking about close to 100 million of euros of unpaid mandatory contribution and tax evasion. And here on the left corner, you have a very important document, because at that time, the president of the National Handball Federation was a person that was a minister of labor and later minister of defense of government of Montenegro, and he was at the same time the president of this handball club. And then the document on the left signals that he was using budgetary reserve to fund his own club. So in a period of 4 years, this club received more than 6 million euros from the defense budget. So this is what I wanted to share with you very briefly, just to give you a clear examples how bureaucratic corruption can unfold within the sports ecosystem, how the sports is very vulnerable to these practices. And perhaps we need to rethink at the global level what we need to do in order to safeguard principles of sport. And I will not comment anymore. At least I will leave this image for the last. And thank you, Professor Dimitris, once again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Begovic, for this very insightful presentation. Allow me to say, I mean, a handball team receiving 6 million euros from the Ministry of Defense, I guess nobody scored a goal against their defense during the championship. Maybe that was the reason behind that, to improve their defense.
Most likely.
But it seems that we policymakers, international organizations, and whoever is interested in sport must improve their defense against crime. And I would say, having heard about the multi-stakeholder, approach and the conceptual framework, in order to improve our defense against such practices, we must stop the links between sports and politics. So it seems to me that politics use and abuse sports to gain power, to gain influence. And believe me, Marko, speaking from a Greek point of view, It seems to me that your 4 cases and your stories that you shared with us from Montenegro are common in the Balkans, in Southeastern Europe, and I guess they are very common, unfortunately, all around the world. So having said that, thank you very much for your presentation. I would now like to move on to our next speaker. This is Professor Christos Anagnostopoulos. Professor Anagnostopoulos is a professor in sports management at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Most importantly, he is the holder of the UNESCO Chair on Governance and Social Responsibility in Sport, which is a joint initiative of HBKU Qatar and the University of Central Lancashire in Cyprus. Christos is an academic and a policy advisor in sports management and leadership issues for many, many years. Professor Anagnostopoulos, you have the word. We can't hear you, Christo. Perfect.
Now it'll be better. Now, just a very quick comment on your comment, Professor Ziouvas, to cut the links between sport and politics. This is a political decision itself. So it is easy to say and much more difficult to do. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this very, very important discussion about corruption and good governance in sport. I guess today we gathered to discuss and explore the challenges as Marko mentioned and showcased, from his own, very rich experience. But also offer some solutions surrounding, our field, which is in our field, fair play and transparency are foundational, and addressing corruption and fostering good governance is very crucial. So I look forward to the discussion and the contribution by all panelists today. Let me share the screen first of all. As Professor Dimitris mentioned, I have the honor to having put together the first ever and globally unique UNESCO chair that is devoted to governance and social responsibility in sport, and this is in essence a chair that is aimed to foster an integrated system of research, of education and training amongst all interested parties that are looking at these topics. Now, I have been also fortunate enough since 2016, when we were putting the research proposal to the European Commission, to be part of a very interesting group of like-minded people, if you like, practitioners, investigative journalists, policymakers, and scholars, led by the Danish National Sports Governance Observer and Play the Game, where we started looking at the problems that Marko mentioned. And initially we started with 10 countries, but then a follow-up study funded by the European Commission that reached out 25 actually countries from across the globe, but the core of the countries from the European Union. We collect data from about 200 national sport federations, and we examine 4 dimensions: the transparency, democratic processes, internal accountability, and the societal responsibility. And you can see the principles next to those dimensions, next to those 4 dimensions. And wherever you see red is not looking good. Wherever you see orange or a little bit yellow, not that good either. And when it starts becoming a little bit greener, the situation is looking much better. These are each column represents a different country, 25 different countries on this slide. And within each country, we looked at about 8 to 10 different national federations within those countries. Now, I think that you can sense why we need to be discussing these matters a little bit more, and why webinars of this type, I guess, are useful and were needed. To see it in a different way, when I was collecting data for Cyprus, for example, until Georgia becomes part of the equation, Cyprus had the privilege, ironically speaking, to be the negative outlier with the lowest score on this index that Play the Game through the National Sport Governance Observer created. So, but at the same time, to connect it with Marko's, if you like, institutional academic affiliation, we were looking at the case of Norway as well. This is the picture in Norway, and this is the picture in Cyprus. This is the picture in Norway. This is the picture in Cyprus. I remind you, when you see red, it's not looking good. Whereas when you see green, is the governance landscape within those national sport federations is a little bit better. Now, against this background, and as I mentioned, Marko offered more, if you like, specific examples of the problematic elements that we are faced with in the broader sport ecosystem. There is a kind of institutional duty, and the institutional duty is attached to the likes of ministries of sport or the highest authorities of sport within individual countries, right? And this duty, this what we call institutional duty, has two dimensions. One is to help those sport organizations to achieve better governance, to help them raise their governance standards. But at the same time, this duty concerns the protection of those organizations, the protection of those people who, in most cases, are volunteers. They volunteer their time, energy, they stay away from families, their own families, to service the sport they probably love and have served in other capacities as well. So there is this institutional duty that has a kind of dual purpose to help and protection. And how countries, how governments, how sport authorities that have a saying that they are trying to steer, if you like, the federations within their own boundaries, national boundaries, achieve that? How can they offer this hand of support and a hand for protection of those organizations? Well, one tool to achieve this institutional duty is through the so-called codification of good governance. And following a couple of other funded research projects from the European Commission, one of the latest ones, the one that we are finalizing as we speak, called Action, led by the Institute for Sport Governance based in Warsaw in Poland, and with partners from Cyprus Sport Organization from Luxembourg. What we're trying to do is to put together a convergent code for good governance. And before we did that, we looked around. We looked at European Union, we look at the countries within Europe, and we try to identify what sort of codes, if any, of those countries have a code for good governance. And our research showed that there are only, at the moment, as we speak, only these 8 countries that have issued a code to offer this hand of support and this hand for protection to the national sport federations. I remember that day when we presented the final version of the code for the national sport federations in Cyprus. For those who cannot read Greek, probably you can see that it is the 5th of June, 2018. And I remember that day because it was one of the, very interesting days of my professional life. The entire board of the highest authority of sport in Cyprus was sitting on that table together with good friends and colleagues from other countries. Dr. Gerard, for example, who was responsible for putting the code for good governance for the Flanders in Belgium and the over there national sport federations. And it was an interesting day because it was a realization how some of us teach organizational change and we talk about resistance to change and all this, but it is only those moments when you are against those people who are running those organizations, who are running, in fact, those organizations for years, if not for decades, when you really give meaning to the notion of resistance to change. Obviously, we faced some problems. We faced problems during the consultation period and after we issued the code. And some of those problems relate to what we call sources or reasons for non-compliance to that tool that I referred to, the tool of the code that serves as a roadmap of how, in a more normative way, admittedly so, but it serves as a roadmap of how these organizations can adhere to standards of good governance or can raise their standards of good governance. So the problems that fall in 2 main categories for non-compliance concern unwillingness to comply. And in a lot of times, any policy document that comes into force and in a way is asking or demanding or encouraging, you name it, people within organizations, entities to do something differently, there is this unwillingness to adopt, to change, and we tend to believe that this unwillingness to comply is the only reason why people within organizations do not comply. But there is also the inability to comply, and I personally came across with a lot of people who have not been unwilling to comply, but rather still are unable to comply with whatever these codes of good governance had therein, and they were trying to suggest and encourage people to do. So if we further break this unwillingness to comply and inability to comply, we can talk about voluntary non-compliance and the involuntary non-compliance. And this is very much kind of research from Arnaud Gerard that emerged from him looking at the international sport federations. But the reason why I shared that slide with me and the others presenting the final version of the code in Cyprus is to share with you that what the bibliography is putting forward is actually happening in practice. So if we further break down these two reasons for non-compliance, we will come across with what we call logic of consequences. In other words, there are people within those sport organizations who are not willing to comply because if they do so, they will have themselves and according to them, their organizations, some consequences. And to put it simply, if they comply, let's say, to the code that the Article 15 calls for a maximum of 12 years term in those organizations, if they comply to that article of that code, that means that this person, the consequence that will have this person is that leave the boards, leave the organization, is out of the game. So she decides not to comply, that is unwilling to comply because of the consequences that this compliance will have on her status within the organization. Always within the voluntary non-compliance logic, there is the logic of the appropriateness. And I came across with this logic too, because they said to me, Christos, if I comply again, which is the most controversial and the most difficult to implement anyway article with the term limits, nobody wants to leave their seat from that table, from that board. So they were telling me that, Christos, if I comply with the maximum term limits, then that will be inappropriate because the country itself will lose a lot of political lobbying that I have developed since I became a member in that sport organization. And then I was asking, but how long have you been a member in that organization and you managed to put this global or European lobbying together? I've been around for 2 decades. So if you drop me out from the board, that means that everything that I have built over the last 2 decades will be wasted. So it is inappropriate for me to comply with that article in that code. Therefore, I decide not to comply. That is a voluntary non-compliance logic. But there were a lot of people, just to be fair, where they expressed very emphatically the reasons for non-compliance being capacity limitations. A lot of them were telling me that, you know what, it's only me here. There are board members, these are volunteer board members, they don't do much, and it is everything that you are asking me to do, transparency-wise, to put documents online, to put forms on conflicts of interest and conflicts of loyalty together, and so on and so on. It is impossible for me to do. I have to book the tickets for the athletes for the next tournament, in France. So I don't have time to adhere to all those little instructions that this particular set of articles within that code is asking me to do. So as much as I want to comply, so we can raise the standards within our organization of governance, I cannot do that. And I could hear them sympathetically. These were problems. These were practical problems. But there were also problems of ambiguity. They couldn't understand what this article was asking them to do. Let's not take for granted that all people who are serving those, in particular, less so the international, but in particular the national sport federations across Europe, are people who have the technical and intellectual capacity to perhaps absorb very quickly what the new norm, that is the codification of good governance, is asking them to do. So they were simply telling me, you know what, I'm willing to comply, but I don't have a clue what you're asking me here. Look at the page 15. What does it mean? How do I do that? And that was, again, a practical issue that was falling within this set of problems where sympathetically, all of us who were trying to perhaps help provide this institutional duty, as I call it before, to protect these people within those organizations, but also to help them raise their standards, were putting forward. So what are the solutions? There are six compliance mechanisms that can be applied in order to address all four logics. First of all, because we're talking about corruption, I think we will be talking about corruption a little bit more with later with the other esteemed speakers in this webinar. But because we're trying to perhaps set the scene of where we are when it comes to governance within the wider sport ecosystem, we need to emphasize the importance of the monitoring, and this is the very first mechanism for organizations to comply with the so-called codification of good governance. We need to implement ways where we monitor the behavior of those organizations. So monitoring, as we say here, decreases the likelihood that non-compliance will go unnoticed. If people within those organizations know that nobody's watching, then the chances for exercising, I'm trying to be a little bit careful with the words I'm using, exercising their power and their opportunities within those sport entities, in doing things that are not, as you, Professor Dimitris, mentioned, ethically and appropriately, that are things that safeguard the integrity of sport, that these people through those organizations serve, then that will be the case. We will keep seeing all these red little boxes across different countries, and we will be staying away from the cases like Norway, for example. So this is the very first mechanism that help us get closer to compliance within those entities. The second one is, as long as we have the first, so we know where we are, sanctioning is the way forward. And sanctioning is more relevant to those people who openly and boldly state that I voluntarily non-comply because of the consequences or because of the, according to them, inappropriateness of this codification. So, but when it comes to sanctioning, we have to make sure that all these sanctions, the cost of these actions is greater than the benefit of non-compliance. If we go back to those, let's say, a national sport federation who is unwilling to comply with that national code, and we tell them, okay, what is the budget every year that the state gives you to run the sport? 1 million. Okay, we're going to cut you 50,000 euros because you are not complying with article number 4 and article number 7 in that code. Okay, they will say, all right, okay, give me 950,000 and I will keep not complying. But if we tell them that you have half the budget next year, then that will hurt. So we have to make sure that the sanctioning is under these parameters. The third one is persuasion. We need to We need to explain to them, but also persuade them about the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the rules. And this mechanism applies a lot to, again, those people who are unwilling to comply, but they put forward the logic of inappropriateness. So for those people who say that I have been around the block for so many years and you have to keep me here to keep lobbying and keep bringing events, through my international network to the country, not in an ethical manner, right? Ethically and following the procedures and everything. But if we don't persuade those people that, as you mentioned, Dimitris, the sustainability is not going to be there. We know that biological reasons we're not going to be here in forever, and those people who serve this sport at some point will have to step down biologically anyway. So we need to persuade them about the effectiveness and the legitimacy of those rules. Then we need to help them understand, and we need to help them interpret all these specifications and the obligations that the codification of good governance is putting forward. We need to build capacity. We need to help them, offering technical assistance, financial assistance. If you have, for instance, from my own experience, helping develop the code for national sport federations for the highest authority of sport in the Republic of Cyprus, I know that the Cyprus Sport Organization provided technical assistance with templates, with standardized web pages to those national sport federations, because a lot of the lack of transparency in those organizations was due to lack of technical assistance. So the Cyprus Sport Organization stepped in and provided this assistance. So we have to make sure one of the mechanisms to help those people, especially under the logic of I want to comply, but I cannot because I don't have the resources, we need to provide all this assistance. And finally, the social learning. Pretty much what we do here today, we share ideas, we share experiences, and we try to get the message across that safeguarding the integrity of sport and doing as much as we can to reduce corruption. And I'm very, very careful with the words I'm using, just to reduce corruption and raise the standards of good governance at the same time. It can only happen through initiatives like the one that you took, Dimitris, for today's webinar, and making ourselves available to be part of those of this social learning, with the hope that the broader sport ecosystem sooner than later will be in a better shape. With this final note, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to further discussing this with you all.
Thank you very much, Christos. While you were presenting to us that index, the Sports Governance Observer results, I was looking at Transparency International, and more particularly, I was looking at the Corruption Perception Index, the CPI. And there is a clear correlation between the standing of a specific country in your sports governance ranking and in the corruption/anti-corruption ranking. So it comes to me as no surprise that Denmark, for example, is number one at the CPI index. So it is the country where citizens believe that there is no corruption, or as less corruption as possible. You correctly pointed out we will try to reduce corruption. We cannot eliminate corruption as such. So Norway is doing great in terms of anti-corruption, and they are doing very well in terms of sports governance. The same with Norway. Norway is number 4 worldwide. So out of 180 countries, Denmark is number 1, Norway is number 4, and Cyprus, because you mentioned Cyprus as opposed to those other countries, which did not do well at that time in terms of sports governance. So Cyprus is number 49 out of 180 countries, and it's doing worse as time goes by. It comes to me as
I think this is a very, very interesting observation, but let me just add something a little bit more provocative, if you like. Unless we measure corruption, nothing is corrupted. So those countries who have the mechanisms in place to measure whether there is a corrupted exercise, then they capture corruption and they are part of the whatever index, right? Those who do not have mechanisms to measure corruption, they report no corruption. They are good boys and girls.
True. True. And your remark points also to some deficiencies, partially a systemic failure of the CPI index, but still it is, the tool that we use worldwide for the time being in order to measure how well a country is doing. You also mentioned that non-compliance sometimes, a good excuse for non-compliance can be the inability to comply because of lacking capacities. And this brings me, this provides a bridge to our next speaker, because international organizations like the Council of Europe or the United Nations are there to provide capacity building mechanisms for their member states, and in order to take away such excuses or to support member states and national authorities in their efforts to find resources and to find know-how and to provide technical assistance to sports management authorities, both in the private and in the public sector. So having said that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Sophie Kwasny. Sophie is the head of the sport division of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is not the European Union. It is another international regional organization which extends to almost the whole continent of Europe. It has currently 46 member states. And Sophie is also the executive secretary of EPAS. EPAS stands for Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sports. EPAS provides a platform for intergovernmental sports cooperation between public authorities of member states. So who is, in a better position to explain how capacity building for compliance and not non-compliance can be systematically, regionally, and internationally supported than Sophie. So, dear Sophie, you have the word.
So good evening. I say good evening. It's already nighttime, evening time here in Strasbourg. So I'd like to thank you for this invitation. It's a great pleasure. Thanks to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the School of Advanced Study of the University of London. Thank you to the co-panelists for sharing the microphone with me on this. And I've focused on combating the corruption and ensuring good governance in sport. And so I'll be presenting what the Council of Europe has been doing on this topic. I thank the other panelists for already referring quite extensively to this work. Myself, I cannot attribute all those laurels. I've been in this job for 3 years in the Council of Europe. You, Professor Ziouvas, you mentioned indeed that the Council of Europe is a different animal than the European Union. So we are based in Strasbourg in France. We have 46 member states, so indeed going quite far towards the east, so a pan-European organization. And the core of our mission is to protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which we have been doing for 75 years. We celebrate this year our 75th anniversary. So how do we do this? You mentioned indeed the assistance, building the capacity, reinforcing the capacity of our member states, but we have a triple level of action, which is a complementary and interdependent one. We set the standards, so we act as legislators at international level, and you will also hear from Ronan at UN level, but this is a similar functioning of intergovernmental organizations. We have our 46 member states that agree on those norms, on those standards. It can be legally binding ones, and I will mention some, or it can be legal instruments that are more of a political or inspirational nature. And then the green arrow that points to the monitoring is evaluating the compliance. And so I'm glad that Professor Anagnostopoulos mentioned that part also. This is a core business for us, is to ensure that the standards that are enacted are actually complied with. And then assistance. It's really going in the field at the level of our member states and building the capacity. So as a human rights organization, you could wonder, okay, why and what is the Council of Europe doing on sports? There is a profound belief of the value of sports for our societies, for social cohesion. I mean, I'm not going to name all the societal benefits of sports, but sport is also deeply replicating the values on which our organization has been founded. And so through sport, we're actually also promoting, educating on our values. This is why we've decided to work on sport issues and for sport to continue to inspire, to protect its integrity. And this is a work that the Council of Europe has been doing for quite some decades, as you can see on this timeline. And the first integrity topic that was picked up by the Council of Europe was the one of doping, because it was about life-threatening situation. There were deaths of cyclists at the time. That led the organization to address the topic. So that was, you see the first instrument, 1967 on the slide. An important reference here, 1975, is the European Sport Charter, as it is now called. You can see it's a 50-year-old instrument, but we've actually modernized it quite recently in 2021. And it's really the basis of sports policies, and it's encompassing all the aspects of sports policies and all actors. 1985, you see spectator violence that then evolved into a broader safety, security, and service at sports events convention in 2016. Our convention on anti-doping in 1989, and the one on manipulation of sports competition in 2014. And I will be focusing about this one to really match the topic of today. So this convention, the Convention on the Manipulation of Sports Competition, is actually essential in this framework of ensuring the integrity of sport. And the notion of integrity of sport has evolved throughout the decades of sport policies. And now our charter, the European Sport Charter, but also the Kazan Action Plan at UNESCO level, acknowledges the multi-dimension of this integrity. So it's about the integrity of people, the integrity of competitions, and here our convention is a clear response, but also about the integrity of organizations. And there we delve into the good governance work. So this convention, we're actually celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. And so I must acknowledge that the drafters of the convention were already 10 years ago quite visionary in identifying, the challenges, the issues, but also we can see the increase actually of the phenomenon. What is specific to this convention is that it's open for accession by any country in the world. And so you can see that amongst the signatories, we have Australia and Morocco. And as to the countries that have ratified, that is the countries that have committed to respect the provisions of the convention, you see 11/12, because we have seen an acceleration of the rates of ratifications, and just very recently 2 ratifications by Belgium and Lithuania, and we are waiting for Spain to deposit, so it can be done basically any days from now. The entire process is finalized, so we should soon be 12, and actually we should soon be much more than 12, because there are a number of countries that are in the last stages of the ratification process. So it's actually great, because what those ratifications enable is that it's bringing together the states that have ratified, that have committed to apply it, and they set up the mechanisms of cooperation and coordination, both at national level and international level, that allow them to exchange information, because this is really the key in combating match manipulation. This is just to give you an idea of the complexity of the field, but also the beauty of what we are doing in bringing all those actors together. So this is what we call the Macroline community. And you can see in those dots the actors, the stakeholders that are essential in fighting sports manipulation. So you have political level, policy making. We have a number of ministers of sport that are really active on the topic and basically pushing their governments to ratify. You need the justice, criminal justice. You need the police, law enforcement, and I think we have police officers connected today. You have the betting operators, because a quite broad proportion of the issue is linked to sports betting. You have the monitoring instances, the regulatory authorities, you have the sports actors, sport organizations, federations, and you have civil society at large. So we need to work together to address the topic, and the role of public authorities, and several of them, is also essential. So the 2 core objectives of this convention is to prevent, detect, and sanction. And so there, through the convention, we're basically triggering adoption of national legislation that allows to act throughout this chain. But also the other really key objective of the convention is to facilitate and promote the cooperation. If you want to address at national level, what we're basically asking our parties, the countries, to do is to set up what we call a national platform, where you bring each of all those actors at the table, because the regulatory authority needs to be able to speak with the sport governing bodies. You need to be able to work with the police, with the public authorities, and all together exchange information, detect and sanction. So this cooperation is really key to the success of combating match manipulation. Those are our priorities now to try to address the topic. And so, of course, we need to increase and have more countries ratifying. We need to improve the betting regulation. And so the committee of the convention is working on this. We need to improve good governance. And so I will also now touch upon a specific part of that, and improve intelligence and detection. What is also key, it's the last one on the left. We've noticed that there was a lacuna in the judicial sanctions and actions. And so we've tried to address that through setting up a network. I will mention it. This is the network we refer to as MARS, the network of magistrates and prosecutors responsible for sport that EPAS has been establishing, and it is essential. We're basically training, raising the awareness of those prosecutors. So it's prosecutors of over 30 countries, making them work together, developing practical tools, and basically enabling them at national level to take the judicial step in sanctioning those cases, which is really key. I was also indeed highlighting the need for the development of good governance. And I would like to point out to an initiative, and Ronan might come and complement me on this, because UNODC, together with the Council of Europe, with the IOC, with the OECD, with some states, in 2017 launched this partnership, which is of high value. It's bringing the sport movement, it's bringing public authorities, governments in tackling corruption in sport. And this partnership, EPAS, had several priority topics, and one of them was good governance in sport. And so for years, the Council of Europe has been coordinating this piece of work, which basically ended up in the publication of this benchmark and guidelines on good governance in sport. So it's quite straightforward. You have 5 pillars, 5 dimensions of good governance. And for each of those 5 dimensions, you have a set of 10 recommendations. So here on the screen, you have those 50 recommendations of the benchmark. I invite you to go on EPAS website, because for each of those 50 recommendations, you have quite a detailed structure, which is this one. For each of the 50, you have definitions, you have an introduction to the specific rule of the benchmark, and basically recommendation on how to reach it, examples of good practices. What I would like to highlight is, if you take just the integrity pillar, that's the second column there, it's quite a comprehensive set of action that is required from the organizations. And so this is basically triggered down to all sports organizations by the IOC and the National Olympic Committees. And it's about having the policies in place, having a protection of whistleblower. But what is key in this good governance framework is that it goes much beyond the integrity aspects. And as you can see, you have a pillar on democracy, which is about the mandates of the elective positions on a sport organization. That's a point that was raised. You have parts on corruption, you have parts on sustainability, on gender equality. So it's a very comprehensive picture of what good governance should be looking like. I conclude on this because this is the topic of the moment. You see the title on the top of the screen, Governing and Governance in Sport, supporting a fresh approach to basically match the societal importance of sport. So if we want sport to thrive for the benefits of our societies, we really need to address its governance. And we've used both terms, governing and governance, because governance, immediately people actually go to good governance. But in the first part of this title, governing, we really wanted to address the issue of collaborative governing. And you mentioned, Professor Ziouvas, this need of decision making, but how do you actually involve all stakeholders? And sport concerns us all. I mean, it concerns the athletes, it concerns the sport organizations, it concerns the public authorities, it concerns the private sector. So we are actually many interested in having this discussion together. So this will be actually very soon, in 2 weeks' time in Porto. It's our ministerial conference. Professor Marko Begovic will be there, and we're very happy for that. But so the topic is a hot topic. We still have a lot to do on it, even if it's been years we've been discussing. So actually, I just like to move really into a core set of actions of those principles that have been developed. And I will finish there. I once again thank you for your invitation and attention, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this great presentation on the work that the Council of Europe is doing in order to promote sports integrity and for keeping the time limits. I have posted in the chat box a link to the Macaulay Convention. This is how we call the 2014 Convention of the Council of Europe against match and competition manipulation. Allow me to remind that the convention entered into force in 2019. so it is already binding for members. And in order to create a bridge with our next speaker, allow me to read Article 15 of the convention. This is a very broad convention. It includes special provisions for prevention, but also for criminal law action. So Article 15, each party shall ensure that its domestic laws enable to criminally sanction manipulation of sports competition when it involves coercive, corrupt, or fraudulent practices as defined by its domestic law. So what those international conventions do is that they oblige member states to criminalize specific behaviors as stipulated by those international instruments. So having said that, we can move on to a very broad international instrument, both in terms of scope of application, but also in terms of scope of member states. I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Ronan Olawar. Ronan is the coordinator of the Program on Safeguarding Sport from Corruption and Economic Crime within the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, Austria. He has been leading the efforts of UNODC in fighting sports corruption for many, many years. Dear Ronan, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak to you all today, and thank you to the previous speakers for their very interesting presentations. So look, I'll share my screen. I hope I can get everything to work. I'll also try and be efficient with the time, given the late hour. But so I suppose from my presentation, what I'll do is, of course, I will touch a little bit on the UN approach to what we're seeing in terms of the type of threats to sport. But I really would like to focus a little bit more time on what we're seeing in relation to the threat posed by organized crime and the linkages, and how organized crime uses corruption to infiltrate and to abuse sport for illicit gain. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a kind of a short overview, a background about UNODC, and then our work in the sports domain, before spending a couple of minutes just outlining some of the results of preliminary results of a report that we will be launching very, very soon on the interlinkages between corruption and organized crime in the sports setting. So just 2 words about UNODC for those who perhaps are not familiar with it. So this is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We're based in Vienna, Austria, but as you can see on the map there, to give you a short overview, we have about 100 different locations all around the world, where we basically look to support governments tackle transnational organized crime threats, the threat posed by corruption, but also those threats linked to drugs. And basically what we're saying about the drug angle there is, in particular, is to ensure that drugs are used for scientific and medical purposes and not abused for other reasons. And we have a very strong policy-making function. Policies are established through resolutions adopted in the context of the implementation of international treaties and conventions, like the UN Convention Against Corruption, like the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And we do, in addition to those resolutions and those policies, we try and back up and support governments with technical assistance, awareness raising, capacity building. And we work primarily with criminal justice authorities, like the judiciary, like financial investigation authorities, like police, border control, anti-terrorism, anti-organized crime. The list really is very long. as you can imagine, there's many different issues in many different countries around the world. And what we do is we set up programs and projects to a value of about 450 million per year. And we use our staff in the field to over 3,500 personnel actually to work in these countries, specifically on projects where there are requests for help, like on human trafficking or corruption, but also a program on a regional level. So we have regional hubs as well, which are designed to, help governments in a more integrated manner. So that's really just a snapshot of our UNODC as a sort of international organization. But just to jump right into the work that I have the pleasure of leading at UNODC, and so maybe a little bit of a historical context. When I say historical, it sounds like maybe too historical, but it really has been just a few years ago when the topic of corruption in a sports setting really came out and grabbed the attention of governments in particular. I don't want to focus in always on the FIFA gate from 2016, 2017, when the Department of Justice really launched its investigation, but that investigation focused minds of government officials on the one level, government officials who were working in the context of tackling corruption, attacking organized crime, and suddenly getting this understanding that the sports sector in general at national levels, regional, international levels were threatened, basically threatened in a way that perhaps hadn't entered into the consciousness of criminal justice authorities in the way that perhaps anti-doping had in the past, the way the interest in match fixing had, of course, but more sort of that linkage with serious crime like money laundering, like exploitation of minors, sexual abuse, human trafficking, but in the sports sector. And so as the realization of these type of threats, the transnational nature of them became more evident, especially with the anecdotal evidence in the media. In parallel, we were seeing how global UN frameworks were suddenly, well, not suddenly, suddenly is the wrong word, but were being used in a way to generate momentum and interest in finding ways that governments could use to help tackle these problems. And I highlight in particular the UN Convention Against Corruption, which entered into force in 2005. Currently, there are not 191 parties to that convention. So it's very much a universal convention at this stage, and really highlights just the commitment and the appreciation that corruption, the negative impact that corruption has on societies. And in that context, we are seeing as UNODC, who is the secretariat to that convention, we're seeing resolutions being adopted when the conference of the parties that have ratified that convention, the Convention Against Corruption, come together every 2 years, and they're beginning to spotlight more and more often the threat posed by corruption to sport. And just in terms of the broader UN nomenclature when it comes to sport, again, up until 2016, 2017, the focus on sport was really something positive, massively positive impact in terms of health, in terms of social and economic development. But again, that timeline, 2016, 2017 onwards, resolutions, suddenly we're seeing language in there about the need to protect sport from these threats that we're seeing. I could go on, I'm happy to discuss it later, but that momentum around the adopting resolutions at the UN level, declarations, programs, new projects around protecting sport, we're just increasing more and more and more. And so that's what led us to develop our program on safeguarding sport from corruption, economic crime. And just 2 words on that, but essentially what we do is, to use the 3 action verbs, we convene, we assess, and we empower. So by convening, what we do is we try and bring the world of sport and the world of criminal justice authorities together in conferences and expert group meetings to look at, to understand better, and to exchange on how to get better at preventing, educating, investigating, prosecuting, sanctioning acts of wrongdoing, acts of corruption in sports setting. In addition to that, the program we assess, and by assess, what that means is that, first of all, we can give technical assistance to governments. So, for example, recently Uzbekistan reached out. They're developing a new law on competition manipulation, and we help them with international good practice to guide them on what perhaps options they have and the type of language they could use. But we also generate reports, thematic reports and geographic reports on the type of evolutions of the threats that we're seeing in the sports context. And then we look to empower, so essentially train, enhance the capacities of criminal justice authorities to tackle these problems. So, but in practical terms, what does it actually mean? That's, I would say, over the last 2 years now, since 2023, we've implemented over 75 activities at a global, regional, national level. And so these are, when I say conferences, we did conference this year on tackling corruption in the Americas and the Caribbean. We also did it for BRICS countries in terms of empowering. We brought prosecutors and investigators from Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Zimbabwe, and Malawi to get them better at doing their jobs, particularly in the context of tackling match fixing in cricket. So that was supported by the International Cricket Council and the International Olympic Committee. And those partnerships, those relationships with the world of sport, bringing them into the conversation and the discussion about how to protect sport has been really a key focus of our work. But just to break things down to more of a sort of showcase kind of the framework that we're using and to kind of explain and simplify the terms of reference of the work that we're doing. The way we're approaching it is to divide it into sports-focused corruption, sports-related corruption, and then look at the interlinkages that that type of corruption has with organized crime. And I think this speaks a little bit to the specificity that Marko talked about in terms of sport and its role it plays in society. There's sort of, let's say, more specific, more unique areas to corruption in the sports setting. So here, Sophie mentioned, of course, the Macklin Convention because of the need to tackle competition manipulation. So that's our sports-focused corruption. It's not unique to sports, but it's really obviously a key issue in the world of sport. But associated that with us is betting and illegal betting in particular. So again, betting, you can bet on many different things, but of course, sport is a massive area of revenue for many sports organizations. But the downside to that, in particular, if it's not regulated properly, you also have illegal betting and the very serious impact that will have on societies in terms of addiction in particular, but also, you know, the vast amounts of money laundering that goes on in illegal betting context. We also looked at sports-related corruption. So think of your classic forms of corruption, like, again, money laundering, but think of fraud, think of abuse of authority, think of illicit enrichment, but apply that to a sports context, like the hosting, the organization of a sports event, the transfer of athletes, the administration of sports organizations. And here's the last point that I'll focus on with the remainder of the presentation is just to look at how those interlink with organized crime. And what I want to maybe flag for those who are interested, we have the website there. You'll see quite a number of different types of resources that we've developed over the years and overviews of some of the policy frameworks that exist. You'll find guides on how to investigate match fixing, competition manipulation, guides on how to prosecute it, how to develop whistleblowing mechanisms. But maybe just as a good reference tool, we developed a year or two ago the Global Report on Corruption in Sport. A very ambitious document, but it was essentially an attempt to set the baseline in terms of our knowledge on what corruption is in a sports context at the global level. So you have 10 different sections there, which really go into in-depth analysis of what the type of threats are, from the gender perspective, from looking at illegal betting, organized crime groups in sport, how to detect, how to report on corruption in sporting, but also includes policy recommendations and case studies. So I really would recommend that document to you as a go-to one for reference materials. But focusing on this problem of organized crime in a sports setting, I think this is a really important area to develop our understanding more on. And when we developed the global report on corruption in sport, we had a dedicated section on that, and you can see it there, section 6, organized crime in sport. We thought that this would be a really easy section to write, but what was interesting about it, that while it was interesting, it certainly wasn't easy, because the amount of actual literature, adjudicated cases, examples of good practice around the involvement of organized crime in a sports setting was very limited. But what we could get was, of course, Dimitris also referred to the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and how it defines organized crime groups. But what we could see is that in a sports context, you of course had mafia-like organized crime groups infiltrating sports organizations at a local level, national and regional level. But you also had, let's say, I dare say, disorganized crime, where you would have officials with power in a sports organization who would come together loosely to exploit those positions to benefit illicitly from their positions of power. But what we're seeing was that there's lots of anecdotal evidence, but not a lot of the scale and the scope of the problem was not really well mapped out. Europol has done an excellent report also on this, but what we're trying to do is keep the conversation going around the type of threats that we're seeing in the sports setting. And we'll be launching very soon a new report that we're calling Game Over, exposing the interlinkages between corruption, serious and organized crime in sport. And just to touch on some of the key points of the report, and it'll be freely available when it comes out in the next few weeks. But in terms of the scale and scope of the threat of organized crime in sport, we see how the report highlights how criminal groups are exploiting vulnerabilities in sports organizations, but this is really more and more exacerbated by the amount of money going in, the transnational nature of what sport is, the nature of sports and how it's developing. But this is really something that we feel this needs much more attention, and there needs to be a lot more systematic collection of data around understanding what the scale of the threat looks like. But we're quite certain that it's quite a serious one. It's serious because of its impact. And of course, there's no point going into the generalities of the threat posed by organized crime in sport in general for society. But what we saw when developing the report was the impact, in particular, in terms of youth and vulnerable communities at a local level, where local organized crime groups can go in, take over a local football club, for example, and use that position to sell drugs, intimidate the local community, establish that as a basis of power for them to export their activities at the local level, but even expand into more international areas. We're seeing in particular football clubs, boxing, tennis, and basketball being really impacted by these threats. I should also flag as well in terms of that impact. Yes, youth, but in terms of what that actually means, of course, being targeted, but we're also seeing human trafficking, sexual abuse, those type of crimes being committed very much in a sports setting. I hardly think this will be surprising for many people on the call today, but it is important to articulate that and put that into continue to draw attention to that issue, because we feel that a lot more could be done in the sports setting to try and tackle that effectively. In terms of the challenges, the involvement, the prioritization continues to be an issue. So the type of threat, as understood by criminal justice authorities, it's not well mapped out, particularly in some regions of the world. Europe, of course, really interested in this area, North America more and more so. Perhaps other regions could deserve a lot more attention to the impact of these groups infiltrating sports organizations, particularly in Latin America and Africa and in Asia. Finally, in terms of strategic responses, ongoing, the awareness raising is key, but developing these global networks that can bring together sports organizations and criminal justice authorities to more effectively share information about these threats. That's something that we're very much focusing our attention on in terms of the program that I'm running. We're hoping to really roll out some new initiatives over the next few months to try and get better exchange of information, to look to work with policymakers and regulatory bodies to think about how to strengthen their national legal frameworks to help address some of the threats that we're seeing in this report. So I'm wary of the time. I'm sorry I maybe went on a little bit too long, but I'll wrap up there, and I would very much welcome any questions you may have. Again, there's our website, and please, if there's no time today, please do reach out by email. I very much enjoy and try and respond as much as possible to requests for information. Part of our job, of course, is to support governments and sports organizations, but anybody who has an interest in the topic, very happy to work with you and to follow up afterwards. I'll finish there, Dimitris, and thanks again for the opportunity, and I'll stay on the line for any questions or follow-up that may be needed.
Thank you so much, Ronan. Allow me to draw your attention to the fact that the United Nations Convention Against Corruption has a review mechanism which is set up. This is very important. The United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention is about to apply such a review mechanism, and this is what currently is missing, but not for long, as we just heard from Sophie, from the Macaulay Convention. And having such a review mechanism at place is so important, because it is one thing to oblige member states on paper, in theory, to criminalize, to prevent, to build up safeguards against sports manipulation, to promote sports integrity, and so on. It is another thing to put pressure on member states through the international community in order to effectively implement those measures. So to monitor, to review the progress made by member states. And this is something that the United Nations Convention currently provides for. Another important issue is that this convention, as well as the Macaulay Convention, have provisions on money laundering. So we must always keep in mind that we must try to trace the money, follow the money. And another important factor, we say we financial criminal lawyers, we say crime should not pay. This is the cost-benefit analysis mentioned by Christos. So we must make sure that benefit, that profit made through crime is taken away from criminals. And to this scope, for example, the United Nations Convention has a specific chapter for asset recovery. So how can we get the money back from criminals? Money laundering, the same for the Council of Europe Convention, and there is a specific convention on money laundering. So how can we prevent criminals from disguising the illicit criminal source of those assets? So these are all very important things. And I can think of no better speaker than our next panelist, Professor Ilias Bantekas, because we follow up on international instruments. Professor Bantekas is a key figure in international law and also in human rights law. He's a professor of transnational law and arbitration at HBKU within the College of Law in Doha, Qatar. He previously taught for many, many years as a professor in London, in the United Kingdom. Professor Bantekas is a very prominent academic internationally. Allow me just to say that the International Human Rights Law and Practice, Cambridge University Press, 4th edition already, 2024, or another edited volume by Ilias, Business and Human Rights, Cambridge University Press, 2021, or the very recent, co-edited by Ilias and Marko, the book about ethics in tennis, and so tennis and transnational law, Cambridge University Press, 2024. These are all great resources for whoever wants to do more in-depth research in the field. So having said that, I would like to welcome Ilias and give him the floor.
Okay, so I'll be focusing on tennis for another reason, that I used to be a fanatic tennis dad, and what's a good, what's the good criteria for a good tennis dad? I guess the most amount of times you've been thrown out of a tennis court by the umpire, right? And I've been thrown out quite a few times in my career. Now, one of the things you realize in tennis is that when your kids go to tournaments, they have to pay, and the cheapest tournament abroad, just a neighboring country, would cost you in the region of about $3,000 to $4,000. Taking your coach with you, the trip, the fee, and so forth. And then you realize, wait a minute, how many of these tournaments can I go to every year? And even with the Qatari salary, you can't afford too many. And so you realize at some point that this thing has to end. Either you become a professional earning money, or the thing isn't really viable. And so in 2018, the Independent Review of Integrity in Tennis was asked to make a report about, how to what level can we see corruption in tennis based on the salary levels and the earnings of the players, and so the report made it clear that only a few people can make money from tennis. Anybody else who goes on and competes in international tournaments and doesn't break even between expenses and earnings has a very high likelihood of being corrupted. And so in the men's game, it was found that up to ATP ranking of 336, that player breaks even. But breaks even means you don't make any money. It just means that your expenses and your earnings are even. And so effectively, the people who make money and get some money is anyone below, usually the ranking about 250. And tennis isn't the only sport. I mean, 250 is okay. If you look at badminton, for example, again, the 2023 Badminton World Federation, the Korean Open, the total prize pool was $420,000, and the winner gets $31,500, and then the last 16 about $1,500. Now the expenses to get to the games anywhere in Europe, just the ticket alone would be about $2,500, then accommodation and so forth. So even if you're in the top 16, you are losing money by going to these tournaments. And so anyone ranked as above 20 in badminton, which is pretty high. I mean, 20 is just get any player from football, 20 is pretty high. Jude Bellingham, would be 20. And so these people would not be breaking even. And so they would be going to tournaments at a loss. And that makes you think, if you go to tournaments at a loss, how do you survive financially? And people below the rank of 20 have no sponsorships, right? So it wasn't huge surprise when one of the best seated athletes, Zulkifli, a few years ago, at the age of 23 and ranked 20th in the world, was found to be fixing matches in the last 2 years prior to being detected. And he was doing that with another player who had, at the end of his career, and they were doing this by fixing matches of the matches that they played themselves, but also matches played by some of their colleagues. And they used to find those colleagues and they used to exchange messages and they used to fix those matches. You can see a player ranked 20 in his game is amenable to match fixing. And just to make the point, this is an issue of as we'll see in the end, it's an issue of governance. And I think this was made clear why it's an issue of governance. So the independent review for tennis said that in order for the men's game, so the average cost was about $40,000 a year for professional tennis players going out in the circuit. These are the kind of the lowest paid players, but these are their expenses, and they're likely to make more than $4,000 even if they do well in this competition. So effectively, anyone above the 250 rank doesn't break even, doesn't make any money. So just to go back to this case, we have the Maestro case, and I think probably Ronan has seen it in his own work. Chap from Armenia, based in Brussels, who organizes a huge racket operation whereby he is able to funnel money to players, effectively to a Bulgarian player in the top 100 in the ATP. She is making money, but she isn't making a huge amount of money from prize money. And so he uses her as a bait to go out to other colleagues to fix their own matches. And this is a huge ring, which goes all the way back to Russia, as it seems. The investigation is ongoing, but I haven't seen any of the latest reports from the Belgian police about where this case has gone, if they have any evidence, and if the prosecution is ongoing. I think probably Ronan has more information on that, and he can tell us. So with this in mind, you would think that the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, will take some measures, right? And so what the ITF does, and tennis, the organization of tennis and its administration is quite complex. There are three governing bodies, whereas usually we have one for every sport, and here we have three major ones. But anyway, the ITF is a sport governing body that collaborates with the IOC to organize the game of tennis in the Olympics, and it also has the less professional tournaments. And so, and so every amateur or semi-professional player in the world would be an ITF player, just to put it simply. And so the ITF entered into a contract with Sportradar, a Swiss data company. And the idea is that Sportradar would provide live information on matches at every level. So we're looking at matches at 360 tournaments per year. So people ranked, from 1,000 to 5,000 and 10,000. So people who, they probably call themselves professional or semi-professional, but they're not breaking even. They're losing money by entering to the event. So, remember we talked about people up to 334 would break even. They wouldn't make any money. So anyone above 334 would be losing money by going to these events. And what does the ITF do? It signs a 5-year deal with this company to provide live data scoring. Why would you need that, when you're ranked 5,000? I mean, your parents go there at best, and maybe your girlfriend would be in the games and nobody else. And so providing live scores doesn't make money for Sportradar, clearly. What does make money is the license to have gambling, betting, so to make these games bettable. So what they're doing is they're making games bettable where people do not make any money from the game itself. There's no prize money. They're actually getting into a loss by going to these games. So the likelihood for corruption and match fixing is very high. For people now in their mid-20s or mid-30s, not making any money from these events, and now these are bettable games, and they can bet on their own games. And given how far they are from the periphery, it's very difficult to detect any kind of corruption taking place. And in tennis, there's two types of match fixing. You can fix an entire game, or you can fix a point or a set or points within the set. And so for the ITF, it's a great opportunity. It's a 5-year deal, and they're going to make billions out of it. And so it doesn't take a genius for the independent review for tennis to say that there's a strong causal connection between the sale of official live scoring data to the lowest level and the growth in betting on matches at that level. No surprise, eh? And so, we've seen the legal requirements, and the ITF, as a sport governing body, has an obligation under Article 12 of the UN Convention Against Corruption to tackle corruption in the private sector. And the same, of course, applies in Article 7 2C of the Macaulay Convention. And even if that wasn't there, we know that the business human rights spectrum has evolved to such a degree, and the responsibility of non-state actors to undertake these duties on their own initiative. And these are prosecutable also offenses. And so in 2018, again, the same review body makes the same, it's quite obvious that, what's the recommendation? Discontinuing the supply of official live scoring data in respect of the development-based tier of the new ITF World Tennis Tour. Of course, you have to, if you continue making these games bettable at this level where people are making no money, the likelihood of corruption is very high, and this happens later on. And so one of the big problems in tennis, and again, we know with every sport governing body, is a matter of regulation. Any entity, any company would be regulated well, within any national legal system. You wouldn't be able to bet on your students passing scores, exams in schools, could you? I mean, especially when the exams are administered by the school. And so, but the problem in sport governing bodies that the Lex Sportiva, the ability of sport governing bodies to regulate themselves and be free from the interference of national governments has led to an anomaly in the system, in that the sport governing bodies are effectively free to make laws about themselves and about their relationships with their stakeholders. What can you do about that? Well, I mean, the Association of Tennis Professionals has tried to have a guaranteed base earnings for players above 250, with a view to avoid making them susceptible to poverty initially, but also to fear from corruption. I will leave it there, but you can see where this is going.
Thank you so much, Ilias, for this insightful presentation and for sharing with us the data, which is very interesting for people who are not involved actively in sport. It shows that sometimes costs do not add up to be even with earnings, especially for those low-ranked athletes. And this, of course, is a major incentive for match manipulation and match fixing. And this makes it also cheap for organized crime, to access these players and engage in illegal betting. I think that we have exceeded the time that we provided for this online seminar. I don't see any questions in our Q&A chat box. There is a remark and a question which has to do with the distinction between amateur and professional sports. Marko has already touched upon. I think this is an important distinction to be made, because this is the way you move into professional sports. You move from amateur sports into professional sports. And if I may say so, maybe the problem in the governance of professional sports administrative bodies is that although being professional and although managing billions of US dollars, we just heard from Ilias that almost 10 billion US dollars is betting in tennis each year. So 2016 to 2022, you mentioned, Ilias, 50 billion US dollars. So huge amounts of money for tennis. Imagine football, imagine cricket, and so on. So it is important for the community that is involved in sports to keep raising awareness about the issues involved, to promote integrity in sports. This can be done by educating the people like we do today with our seminar, and by sharing knowledge with the community, with students, with professionals, with practitioners, and also sharing best practices as we did today. Since we have exceeded our time, I would like to thank once more the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies for hosting this event, the International University of Europe for Applied Sciences for co-organizing together with Pantheon University of Athens. And I would like to explicitly thank our great speakers, Ilias, Marko, Sophie, Ronan, and Christos. Yasser could not join us as a speaker because of another urgent engagement. But thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for contributing to this event, for attending this event, which will be made, the recording will be made available on the University of London website. I think that this discussion will continue after this event, and we must soon meet again in order to exchange views, exchange questions and answers, and make sure that sports and human rights, that sports is a safe environment, that fair play is guaranteed, and that we keep this beautiful sector of our lives free of crime. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye-bye.